Known as Bert to the troops who fought here in 1916, the small French town of Albert sat at the heart of the Somme. Here countless thousands marched to and from the trenches beneath the shadow of the Golden Virgin. More than 100 years ago, it seemed as if all roads led to Albert. We're on the Somme battlefields this week, and we're standing outside the railway station in the town of Albert. Albert, or Albert, or Bert, as the troops called it, was the main staging post for the British Army on the Somme front throughout its operations here in 1916. In the early phase of the war, this had been a French sector. The French armies had stopped the Germans in the advance to the sea in the battles here in September and October of 1914. And then the front lines had stabilised on the outskirts of the town, from the northern villages like Gommecourt and Serres and Beaumont-Hamel through Thiepval down to Overlers and La Boisselle and across towards the southern part of the Somme sector as it moved towards the river valley in villages like Mametz and Montauban, and beyond that villages like Curlu and Hem close to the river Somme itself. Following the early battles around Albert, the front became static. It was quite a quiet sector. There were some operations here and there in 1915, but the bulk of France's efforts was elsewhere on the Western Front at that time, whether in the north, at Notre-Dame-de-Lorette, Souchez and Hill 145, or Vimy Ridge as we'd call it, or down around Reims in the Champagne with the attacks on positions like Navarin Farm and the Man de Massige, places that we've mentioned in previous podcasts. The Somme was quiet. There was, to a degree, a live and let live system. That was until the summer of 1915, when British units began to arrive in this sector, coming down from the northern part of the Western Front as the British Army gradually extended its line. Now, we didn't take over the entire Somme front at once. British units were intermingled with French ones at different parts, and Albert wasn't truly British really until the autumn into the winter of 1915-16. And the railway station where we are now was once a main route into these battlefields, particularly in the early period of the war. British troops passed through here in 1914. There are photographs of them on Albert Station that appear on picture postcards of that period. But for the French army, when this was their front line on this part of the Somme, this was where they brought in not just their men, but their supplies and their ammunition and their shells and everything else. And that remained in place when the British began to take over this sector, when Albert became a British echelon behind their lines. But increasingly, particularly as 1915 moved on into 1916, and the British became very active on the Somme front, for us there was no such thing as a quiet sector, no such thing as live and let live. We wanted to take the war to the enemy. The enemy's wire was our front line. We were active in no man's land, and we shelled the enemy positions. And of course, they reacted to this. And part of that included the bombardment of the town of Albert. And what that meant for the railway, a bit like the railway in Ypres. When we did a walk in Ypres, we discussed how troops had come into Ypres to the station there in the early period of the war, but then the Germans had taken the ground around the city and could observe it and bombarded it, and it became impractical. And that was essentially the same thing here. The Germans couldn't necessarily directly see the area around the railway station, although increasingly they began to use observation balloons that gave them that element of observation into positions like this. But with a railway station marked on a map, then it was quite obvious that trains were going to come in there, and therefore there would be men, supplies, weapons and anything else that would offer targets of opportunities for your guns. So the British began to increasingly not use the station to bring anything in. It became abandoned, effectively. The buildings around it were no doubt used, but the station itself wasn't. And we instead built a railhead on the outskirts of the town, away from direct observation of the Germans, in what was a bit of a valley on a sloped ridge, which was called Edge Hill, quite likely named after Edge Hill railway station near Liverpool in Britain. But this became the main route in for men, supplies and equipment. There was a proper area of railway sidings constructed here, and trains could come in night and day disgorge the troops that could then march to the fronts, unload the supplies, unload the ammunition, and take them up to supply points on or near the battlefield. There were medical facilities in Albert. A number of field ambulances operated in bigger buildings within the town itself in 1915 and on into early 1916, but casualty clearing stations were created on the outskirts of Albert, at Dernancourt, for example, and so that was the main evacuation routes of casualties from the front line, from the battlefield, through Albert to a dressing station, and then onwards to the casualty clearing station, and then additional railheads were built there to evacuate them back through the railway systems to Amiens, and then beyond that to the base hospitals at places like Rouen or up on the French coast. And in fact, in 1915-16 and throughout much of the Battle of the Somme of 1916, casualties evacuated from the Somme front were not taken up to Calais and Boulogne and Étaples. They were sent to Rouen and to some of the coastal areas of Normandy, around Le Havre, for example. And we see cemeteries in that area that have casualties from this period, men who died of their wounds, particularly at St Saviour Cemetery and St Saviour Cemetery Extension at Rouen, which has a huge number of Somme casualties buried in it, men who died of their wounds received on this part of the Western Front. The railway line at Albert sits on the line that runs from Amiens through Albert, up the valley of the Ancre, and up towards Arras, and beyond that to Lille. It's on the main Amiens to Lille route. And I've mentioned this quite a few times in the podcasts about the joy of travelling on the train across these battlefields, and it's quite an interesting thing to do, to get a return ticket to Amiens from here, for example, and go in that direction and pass by some of the sites of these casualty clearing stations. You go on the railway embankment above where the casualty clearing station was at Dernancourt, and you can see Dernancourt Cemetery, and that area became a battlefield in 1918, and then you carry on down towards Amiens, first towards Corbie, but before you get that, you're in the area around Highley, where Highley Station Cemetery is, and the casualty clearing station's there, and you get, again, a different perspective of it. And going the other way, from Albert up towards Arras, you go up through the area where the fighting was, so the railway line takes you up through the Ancre marshes, past Hamel, past Thiepval, past Saint-Pierre-d'Evian, up towards Miramont, and then you're in the ground between Miramont and Arras, where a lot of the fighting was, particularly in the spring of 1918, as the Germans were pushing us back, and then in the final offensives of 1918. And as you travel up there, you see cemetery after cemetery, and you get some very different views of monuments like Thiepval. So when we get that chance to return to the battlefields, if you want to do something a little bit different on your next trip, I'd recommend taking a short train ride from somewhere like this up towards Arras or down towards Amiens or whatever. And for me, it's always quite special to come to this railway station, because this was my entry point to the Somme in July 1982, the first time I came here. The previous month, I'd been in Ypres with my school, and I persuaded my dad that it was a good idea that we came over to these battlefields, and arms with Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That and Rose Coombs' Before Endeavours Fade. We came across on the Channel Ferry from Newhaven to Dieppe, and then took the train from Dieppe down to Amiens, and then from Amiens into Albert. And I remember, I can picture it still, coming into the town and standing by the train door and looking out across the rooftops and seeing the tower and the golden figure on the Basilica. And this was Albert, this was Somme country, and it would be a place and a region, of course, that would occupy a considerable part of my life thereafter. And little did I know at the time that route that I'd taken by train from the coast down towards Amiens and then through that valley up towards Albert was a route that had mirrored the approach of the troops in 1915 and 1916. And as I exited the railway station, up on the wall, and it's still there to this day as far as I know, as you come out of the station, is a map of the Circuit de Souvenir, the circuit of memory, which was constructed by local tourism, I think in the 1970s, to try and develop a bit of interest in the battlefields around Albert. And it shows a little route that you could take, which is still marked to this day, where you can travel around the principal sites and visit the main cemeteries and memorials. And staring at that, suddenly there were all these names that I'd begun to read about: Beaumont Hamel, Thiepval, Pozières, Contalmaison, there it all was, and suddenly I was on the Somme. In this area around the railway station, there is very little to remind us of the Great War. There's a couple of statues that were put up during the centenary. There's a 1930s aircraft hanging from the ceiling of the booking hall of the station, and that is to do with the aircraft factory that was then on the outskirts of Albert, where French aircraft were built during that period, and latterly in the Second World War it was taken over by the Germans and used to build spare parts and aircraft fixtures for the Luftwaffe, and was very heavily bombed by the RAF. Albert had a bit of damage in the Second World War, but of course nothing like it had been in the Great War, when the town was almost entirely destroyed by 4 years of conflict. When I first came here in 1982, I don't think really anything had changed in Albert since the 1920s. The square here had quite a few cafes in those days. Most of those sadly have faded away now. And it was a quiet, sleepy French town in what was then, and probably still is to a degree, a bit of a backwater. So we'll walk away from the railway station now and follow the road that comes out of the railway square going towards the town centre and takes us across a roundabout and into the square in front of the Basilica, the big church in Albert, and that will be our next stop. We're standing in a little square in the centre of Albert with a load of shops and some cafes around us, and in front the tall tower and the mass of the church of the Basilica of Notre-Dame de Brébières. Our Lady of Brébières was a local saint, and this had been a place of pilgrimage, the town of Albert, for many, many years, long before the Great War. But finally, just 2 short years before the Great War, in 1912, a place for those pilgrims to come to and worship properly, a basilica, this church, had been constructed. So what was here, this big tall tower with the golden figure of Mary on top with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus, all of this was only finished 2 years before the guns began to fire with the battles of 1914 and onwards. And in 1915, the top of the tower being used as an observation post. The Germans were not daft. They knew that the French were up there using this tower to spot their lines and the trenches around the town of Albert. They regularly tried to shell it and bring it down, and a shell struck it, and that figure of Mary then toppled over at this roughly sort of 90-degree angle, and it looked as if it would fall into the square below. So the French engineers who were operating in the town at that time went up and put some wires. You can see it on some of the photographs of the period, these wires coming out of the base of the figure of Mary to secure it, to stop it from toppling down. It was said, that the French being pretty superstitious anyway, that when the Virgin fell, the war would end. And as we'll discuss in a minute, it did come down in 1918, but not on Armistice Day. So that figure was up there, and it became really one of the dominant features on the Somme landscape for the British troops who came here in that early period of 1915, and in particular during the fighting here in 1916, because most men came into the Somme through Albert, coming off the trains at Edge Hill near Dernancourt and marching up, and then using the route underneath the Basilica to march up to the battlefields beyond. And even once the fighting moved on beyond the original front lines towards the villages like Pozières and Courcelette, and then to the south, Bazentin, Longueval, and the woods like Delville Wood and Highwood, troops moving up into those areas came through Albert as well. So the town was a significant landmark, and this tower, this obvious tower with the golden figure of Mary on top, was a even more familiar landmark for the troops. And within the town itself, right up until the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, French civilians continued to live in Albert. Now, this was one of the great problems that the British Army had in the First World War, is that France was our ally, and we couldn't just throw civilians out. The Germans, on their side, could evacuate who they wanted, when they wanted, because they were the enemy, they were the occupying force. But we didn't have the same sort of jurisdiction over these people. We had to ask permission, effectively, before we removed civilians from an area that we wanted cleared. And it was a great problem because it meant that to a degree we were responsible for the safety of these people, because Albert was shelled and they could be killed, and there are names on the town war memorial that indicate that civilians did die here during that period. Also, with the arrival of gas warfare, it meant having to issue French civilians with gas masks to protect them from gas that, although Albert might not be directly targeted by the Germans with gas, it could drift in off the battlefield and threaten the civilians who were there. So what did these civilians do when they were in Albert? Well, mostly they exploited the fact that there were troops here. Now, apart from probably quite early on, not many soldiers were billeted in Albert because there were close proximity streets, not as many houses with cellars that could be used. And you get a sense from reading the early diaries and the early war diaries of units that were here that it wasn't the best place to billet troops. They instead used the villages beyond Albert. But troops were in and out of Albert all the time, picking up material, getting ammunition, fetching fresh water, and going about a multitude of other tasks. So it was very much a military town. And that meant that there were soldiers with potentially money in their pocket. So these French people who remained here, understandably, looked to exploit that situation by selling things to the troops, whether that was additional food that they might like, drink, although they were on a bit of a rocky ledge trying to sell particularly liquor to the troops for all sorts of reasons. But also there were a number of services that were laid on. Hairdressing, for example. A couple of the accounts of troops that were here in 1915 talk about having their hair cut by French barbers in Albert. But there was also, interestingly, at least one photographic studio. And these photographic studios that operated just behind the front during the First World War are fascinating, because when you collect these images, which I have done over many, many years, you begin to see the same backgrounds on a lot of images. And then occasionally you get one, if you're lucky, that actually denotes where it was taken. Albert, 22nd of January 1916 on the back of it, for example. So you begin to realise that these photographic studios were there, and if you see a background, you know what, that's Arras, or that's Wallay-Ballon, or that's Albert. And there is a particular backdrop that was used in the one here at Albert, and I'll put an example of this on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, but it was in a position where in the background was the tower of this basilica with the leaning figure of Mary, and in some of the photographs that were taken there, you can see that in the background. A little bit before COVID, I went to the local antiques fair here in Elsica. They have one every month there, and I picked up a little collection of images to the 17th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers, who were the North East Railway Pioneers, a unit formed in Hull from men who'd worked on the railways and then worked as a pioneer battalion on the Western Front. And this was a selection of photographs of men from that unit taken by the photographer here in Albert, which was doubly confirmed because one of the shots showed the guy sitting there, and there in the background was the Basilica. So the original of this building was a really important structure to the men who were here, like the Cloth Hall at Ypres, and in the post-war world up there, of course, the Men in Gate Memorial. The tower here of the Basilica and that figure of Mary was really, really something that almost every soldier marched under or could see from the trenches, because if you were in the front line between Thiepval and Overlers and La Boisselle and across towards Fricourt, you could look back towards Albert, and there it was always there. And soldiers, again, buying things from the civilians here in Albert, they bought picture postcards of it. They wanted to send a photograph of it back to their family through the army postal system. And one thing that the French civilians did is that they made these postcards available, and there were little stalls where soldiers would come along and buy a little book of them or individual cards and then take them away as souvenirs or send them home. So I would guess probably millions of images of this building and of that figure of Mary on the top were sent home, not just to British homes in the Great War, but right across the wider empire, once Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders and South Africans and the people from all those far-flung corners of what was then the empire came to serve here during the Great War. So in that respect, it became really almost an iconic symbol of having served on the Somme front and an iconic location along the British sector of the whole Western Front. It was known to the troops as the Leaning Virgin or the Golden Virgin. Henry Williamson published one of his novels about the Great War called The Golden Virgin, in which there's this fantastic artwork imagery of the Basilica and the figure of Mary on top as part of the front cover. And when the Australians came to the Somme in the summer of 1916, they saw this, and of course, being Australians, they had to call it something different. So they called it Fanny Durack. Now, Fanny Durack was an Australian Olympic swimmer. She'd won a gold medal for Australia for swimming in the 1912 Olympics. So she was, to that generation, a bit of a household name. And they figured it looked like Fanny Durack diving off a diving board into a big Olympic-style swimming pool. And so it became known to them as Fanny Durack. It stayed up there throughout most of the war. The Somme moved on after the winter of 1916-17 to become an area behind the lines as the fight continued to the Hindenburg Line and other sectors of this part of the Western Front. And at that stage, the railway station that we've just been to was likely reopened again, and supplies and equipment came through here, and it was still part of the infrastructure of the British Army on this part of the Somme sector. But the war returned here in the spring of 1918 with the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, the breakthrough near Saint-Quentin, and in the ground between Saint-Quentin and Arras. It pushed the British armies back across the ground that had been captured in 1917, and within a week brought them back to the villages where the great battles had been fought here in 1916. And Albert fell to the Germans on the 27th of March 1918. They were stopped on the far side of the town, where the railway line, continuing from the station where we started, goes into a deep cutting on the Amiens Road. And men from the 12th Eastern Division, including men from the Suffolk Regiment, stopped the German army at that point and brought their advance to a halt. And there is a demarcation stone on the railway bridge over that cutting that marks that particular event in March of 1918. And what that meant was that Albert and this basilica and this tower was now in German hands. And again, I'll put a German image that I have taken by a German photographer, a German combat photographer, in Albert in March 1918, showing the basilica as it was then. And I'll put that on the podcast website. And of course, just as we had used this tower, and just as the French had used it before us as an OPIP, an observation post, to go up to spot for the guns, we knew that the Germans would do exactly the same thing, having captured the town now. And with our front lines on the outskirts of Albert towards Amiens, in the villages that had once been billeting grounds in 1916, we knew that from the top of that they could see down into our positions there. So a British heavy artillery group with heavy guns from the Royal Garrison Artillery began to shell the basilica, and sometime in early April of 1918 the tower was brought down by these guns, possibly by fire from 9.2-inch howitzers. The tower was brought down, and the figure of Mary with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus, that came down too. And what happened to it after that is anybody's guess. It was not salvaged from the rubble post-war. I don't believe it was solid gold. It was certainly gold-plated. So whether some Gefreiter managed to cart it off to Berlin at some point, who knows, but it was never recovered. And the church, the basilica then, was in ruins. Albert sat on the front line until August of 1918 with the Second Battle of the Somme and the pushing back of the German army. Units from the 47th London Division, these London territorials that had fought on the Somme in 1916 and found themselves back in this ground again in 1918, they were the ones that put patrols into the outskirts of Albert in August 1918 and gradually pushed the Germans back as they withdrew. And they fought quite a considerable battle on the far side of Albert down towards Bray-sur-Somme in the days that followed. There's a whole series of photographs from that period showing a patrol from the London Irish Rifles coming into the town. And Andrew Thornton, who we had on the podcast a few episodes ago now, wrote a very, very good article on those photographs, which I'll put a link to from the webpage, which you can have a read. It's really quite a good analysis of what those photographs are about and what they depict. And what that meant, that once Albert was liberated, it was now a town in almost total ruin. It had received bombardments from the Germans in 1916. It had seemed safe again. Quite possibly French civilians had begun to return here in 1917 when this was behind the lines. But in March through to August of 1918, it was bombarded and bombarded and bombarded by British guns this time. And the town was almost totally destroyed. Hardly a building stood, and the Basilica was just this massive pile of rubble. So once again, when we stand in a place like this and we look around us, and there's quite a lot of Art Deco features on the buildings here in the centre of Albert, we see the rebuilt Basilica, we see these rebuilt buildings and the shops. Everything here dates from the 1920s or later. There isn't, to my knowledge, a single original building anywhere in the town of Albert. It was part of that red zone of almost total destruction that existed right across this region of France. Albert twins with the city of Birmingham after the First World War. Many of the towns and cities in Britain did this with places here on the battlefields to help them in their reconstruction. And to this day, just off to our right, standing in front of the Basilica, is the Rue de Birmingham that stretches out towards the battlefield area that was named in honour of that twinning that took place in the immediate period after the First World War. When you go into the Basilica today, it is a typical, almost cathedral-like building, completely restored to what it once looked like. The figure of Mary is on top, no longer at that 90-degree angle, upright again. And there are certain days of the year where you can go up the stairs right to the top of the tower and enjoy the same sort of views that observation officers had, whether they be French, British or German, during the First World War across the old battlefield. And I would very much recommend that you do that if you ever get a chance to go up there. Before we leave the area of the Basilica, there's a couple of other things I wanted to discuss. Just to the right of it is the entrance to the Somme 1916 Museum, started back in the late 1980s by Dominic Zanardi, who now runs Le Tommy Bar at Pozières. There was no museum in Albert, and Dominic saw an opportunity to bring his incredible collection and some of the other collectors that he knew together to create this museum, and it's been open ever since. It was originally called the Musée des Abris, the Shelter Museum, and the reason for that is that it exists in tunnels beneath the square where we are. It comes out in the gardens where the River Ancre that runs through Albert is quite visible at that point, and they breed fish in there, and you can see them throughout the year. And those tunnels that the museum is built into were then used quite likely in the First World War as shelters, but certainly in a far more organised way in the Second World War when the town of Albert was bombed. Not by Nazi Germany, of course, but by British and Commonwealth and American air forces who were coming over to not bomb the town, but bomb the aircraft factory on the outskirts. But of course bombs could stray, and there was some damage, not a lot, but there was some damage in World War II in the town. The museum's always worth a visit. It's got some incredible artifacts in there. Some of the original material that Dominic put in there is still part of the museum, but they've added to it a lot over the years, and it is well worth coming to see if you've never had a chance to visit that museum before. But also here, if we swing round with the Basilica in front of us, turn right round, and on the far side of the square is a hotel, the Hotel Basilica. And that's where I first stayed on the Somme, and that very first visit in 1982, that's where I stayed with my father. And staying in there at the same time was a couple of English guys who said, "Have you seen the poster on the window?" And on the window was a poster with crossed poppies and the name of an organisation called the Western Front Association, which at that time was only a couple of years old. And it was a poster outlining what they were wanting to do to remember the Great War, to ensure that it wasn't forgotten, and the address of the founder, John Giles, at Gilton Mill at Ash near Canterbury. So I wrote to him when I got back from this trip and said, I'm only a teenager, but I'm fascinated by the Great War. My grandfather was in it, my great uncles were in it, and I really want to learn more, and I've just come back from walking the Somme, and one day I'm going to write a book. And he wrote back to me, John Giles, this incredible letter, which I still have, really, really full of encouragement and full of enthusiasm, and really delighted to hear from someone so young who wanted to carry on and continue with that torch of remembrance and understanding of the Great War. And in those early years of the Western Front Association, I encountered this a lot. Nobody was dismissive of someone young coming along to study this and be interested in it. Quite the contrary, they were very supportive. And it's something that I personally have continued to do as I've got older now, because there is a new generation of people coming through who are interested in the First World War, and it's important to support and encourage them and help them develop their own interest. And they will have different perspectives to me, just as I had different perspectives to John Giles and Martin in Middlebrook and Lynn MacDonald. And that's how this continues, really, and that can only be a good thing. And every time I go past the Hotel Basilica, I always cast an eye to that window and think back to where spotting that poster, where it took place, and what writing down that address and following that through, where it led me. Happy memories. So we'll leave this bit of Albert now. We're going to take a little street on the far side of the square where we are, Rue Jeanne d'Arcourt, and then take that up into the main square of Albert in front of the town hall, and that'll be our next stop. We're standing in Place Émile Le Turc, which is the Grand Place, the main square of Albert, the market square in many respects. They have a regular market here, and today there's a couple of these chip wagons where you can get French frites, which is quite handy when you've been out all day tramping the battlefields. This square really hasn't changed very much. I mean, there was a monument here before the Great War to the Franco-Prussian War. When you read the accounts of British soldiers who came into Albert in 1915 when it was very quiet and in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme, they're not greatly impressed by Albert. They're impressed by the Basilica and the tower there, but they're not impressed really by the town, not in the same way that they perhaps were by Ypres. Perhaps the Flemish architecture was, on what was left of it, was more appealing to these men, but Albert, it was just a backwater French town, and with lots and lots of terraced houses. Quite a few of them remarked that it looks quite a dismal place, and a place where perhaps working men knew their place, and therefore it was a place of industry and toil. And there were a couple of factories. There was quite a big bicycle factory in Albert before the First World War, so it did have that degree of industrial employment, but it wasn't really heavy industry in any shape or form. The bulk of employment in and around Albert was on the land at the time of the First World War. And with the rebuilding of the town of Albert, life moved on and life returned. Markets returned here. There's a circus that comes to Albert and takes over this square every year. There's one of the main schools on the far side of the square. And they have what the French call vide-grenier or brocantes, what we'd call car boot sales in this square as well. And back in the 1980s and then the 90s, when I lived on the Somme, it was quite amazing really what would turn up in the boot fairs in places like this. I came here once and a guy had a very good condition French poilus helmet, an Adrienne helmet for sale, and I bought that for my collection. And he said, "Oh, you're interested in war stuff?" He said, "I've got this, but you need to come round the back." So I went round the back of his stall to his car, and he pulled out an Intermarché carrier bag, opened it up and said, "Look in there." And there was a Webley revolver with about a dozen rounds of ammunition. He said, "I found this in my grandma's loft. Do you want to buy it?" And I politely declined, because although firearms laws in France are somewhat more relaxed compared to the UK, not in respect of non-deactivated handguns. But I mention this because, in places like Albert, where the British Army had been for most of the war, we left behind a huge amount of material. Not so much weapons, but in terms of the boxes and the crates and the rum jars and the shell cases and everything else. And French people who came back after the war to rebuild their lives and salvage whatever they could, salvaged all this stuff and used it. And as generations have moved on and Grandma, who had to do all this, has passed away, the French don't tend to throw this stuff. They put it up in the grenier, up in the loft, and then eventually someone comes along and clears that loft, and that's when they find this sort of material. So you just never knew when you came to one of these brocantes or vide-grenier. Quite literally, that means to clear out a loft. You never knew what you were going to find, and it could be anything, from personal stuff, cap badges, through to seemingly never-ending supply of SRD marked rum jars in all shapes and sizes, small ones, standard ones, and massive great ones as well, and rum jars in wicker baskets and rum jars with handles on the top. I mean, there's a study in rum jars alone. Perhaps Professor Peter Doyle, who we had on the podcast recently to talk about his upcoming book on the Princess Mary's gift tin that was dished out in 1914, perhaps he'll do a book on rum jars for us at some particular point, because it's an interesting study, and they were used for all sorts of things, not just rum, of course. But I digress slightly. I mean, during the war, this square was a hive of activity. This was part of the route up to the front line, and there are some photographs showing equipment and ammunition dumps in and around this part of the square. It was probably an advanced point in which stores were dumped before they were moved up towards the front line area, most likely from this point onwards up towards the trenches on foot. So infantry units, and it's quite a common thing, that were out of the line, either billeted in Albert itself in that early period or in one of the outlying villages, would be called in to pick up this material and carry it back up to the trenches. So rest for them didn't really ever mean rest. And sometimes when you look at the story of what these units were up to at that time, and you see that they've had one or two fatalities, but they're out on rest in a village like Dernancourt, Mult or somewhere like that, you think, well, how is that possible? But then you look at the war diary, and there they are on carrying parties, carrying up barbed wire stakes, timber, duck boards, whatever it is. And in doing so, they've gone back into the trenches, back into the battle area, been shelled, and they've lost men going to and from the battlefront. We'll walk up to the town hall now, because there is precious little to remind us of the Great War. This is not an exact copy of the town hall that was here before the First World War. It's very much a 1920s, 30s building. You can see a bit of Art Deco influence on this, and indeed quite a few buildings in this square. And what there is here, just as we go up the steps on the right-hand side, is a plaque commemorating the men of the Machine Gun Corps. Now, we spoke to Richard Fisher recently about the training and the weaponry and the importance of the Machine Gun Corps. And considering that important role, it's odd that their only memorial here on the Western Front battlefields is this little plaque close to the steps of the town hall of Albert, which I would guess that most people coming to the Somme never ever get to see because they don't realise it's here. It was unveiled before the Second World War, at one of the sort of peaks really of battlefield tourism in the 1930s. And Graham Seaton Hutchinson, who we've mentioned quite a few times on this podcast and in that chat with Richard, was one of those involved in this actually happening. And it's quite sobering to read the plaque, and I'll read to you now what it actually says. To commemorate the glorious heroes of the Machine Gun Corps who fell in the Great War 1914 to 1918, 170,500 men of all ranks served in the Corps, of whom 13,791 were killed and 48,258 were wounded or missing. Upon the battlefields of which this place was a pivot were fought some of the most famous actions in which the Machine Gun Corps distinguished itself. This memorial was erected by the Machine Gun Corps Old Comrades Association, Easter 1939. And just 6 months later, the world was at war once more. Leaving the town hall, we'll walk back across the square towards the Basilica, and we'll go left onto the D938, which becomes Rue Victor Hugo, and we'll follow that round the corner to the town war memorial. It's quite a big war memorial, this, commemorating the citizens of Albert who died in both world wars, but obviously in particular when it was built for the Great War. It commemorates the sons of Albert who went off to fight and died on battlefields like Notre Dame de Lorette and Verdun and the Chemin des Dames, but also civilians as well who died in and around Albert during the war. And then continuing past that, we stay on the D938. We pass the Hotel de la Paix on the left-hand side, and that was another one of the places that I used to stay at when I came to the Somme battlefields in the 1980s on into the 90s. And then when I lived at Courcelette, we often came here for a meal. But in those early visits, the bar often had a handful of British people in it, and very often there were veterans coming across with family members in those last years of their lives. Just as the Second World War veterans now returned to Normandy or Monte Cassino, these were Great War veterans who suddenly had that urge, that desire, that need to come to the battlefields, to come and see where they'd fought, and very often see the grave of a comrade who died alongside them. And I had countless fascinating conversations with Great War veterans in the bar of that hotel. And again, it's something, whenever I pass it, I always think of that. As we come out towards the outskirts of Albert, the road forks off to the right. It goes down towards Bray. We'll go off to our left, and we're going to pass the beginning of the big civilian cemetery on the right-hand side. That'll bring us up to where the Commonwealth plot is a little bit further along, and that'll be our next stop. We're now in Albert Communal Cemetery Extension. This was a British plot made here when we began to take over this part of the front in 1915, probably alongside existing French graves, which have now been moved to the outskirts of Albert in a French military cemetery there, or repatriated back to where they came from, as was the common French practice. So this cemetery covers the period of the quiet sector of the Somme when we first took over in 1915, through to the beginning of the Great Battle here in 1916 and all the different actions that followed, and then some later 1918 graves as well, when this area was fought over again both in the spring and the summer of that year. There are 863 British and Commonwealth graves from the First World War. There's also 25 from the Second World War, because there was a bit of fighting around Albert in May of 1940 as the British Army pulled back towards the coast. And there was a bit of fighting again in September 1944 as the 9th SS Panzer Division defended this area. There was a bit of a skirmish, in fact, just down the road from the cemetery, and one of their Panther tanks was knocked out there, and a German tank ace was killed in that engagement. And British troops who came into the town at that time that were killed in the fighting in and around it were brought here for burial. So there's 25 Second World War graves. Of both the First and Second World War graves, 12 from the First World War are unidentified and 8 from the Second. So only 12 out of 863 from the Great War are unknown, because this was a cemetery created by medical units that operated in Albert, and also increasingly, right from the very beginning it seems, to bury dead from the front line. So units that were in the trenches in front of La Boisselle and Overlers and Fricourt, and a little bit further to the north in what we later called Nab Valley before Thiepval, men killed there were brought back here for burial, particularly officers. And that practice continued on into the Battle of the Somme in 1916. So when we look at the burials, there are 608 British, 202 Canadian, 38 Australian and 3 Indian. And it's a cemetery designed by Edwin Lutyens, one of the chief architects of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So there's 202 Canadians buried in here. It's quite a high number, and it is an important Canadian burial ground from 1916 because it's linked with the Canadian Corps' attack at Courcelette and the fighting there from September through to November of 1916. It was part of the main evacuation routes. Once the village of Courcelette was captured, dressing stations were set up in the ruins of the chateaux that were there, in particular the Red Chateau that had really big cellars, and then they were evacuated by ambulance down the Courcelette-Pozières road. There were collecting points that casualties could be brought to along the sunken part of that road, just on the outskirts of the village, and then evacuated through Pozières, through Casualty Crossroads, and then down into Albert, into the field ambulances that operated the main dressing stations in Albert. And if men died of their wounds, they were buried in the cemetery here. So there's quite a lot of units that were involved in some of the key battles for the village, or for Regina Trench, or later Desire Trench, that were casualties from those actions, brought back here, sadly died of their wounds, and buried in the cemetery. So it gives quite a good cross-section of the units and sort of men that fought with the Canadians at Courcelette in 1916. But again, like in the early period, the Canadians brought some of their dead back here for burial. So there's the grave of Lieutenant Colonel R.P. Campbell, for example. Now, he was a medical officer in the 6th Canadian Field Ambulance, and he was killed in the main street of Courcelette by a shell going to the dressing station that was there. These medical officers, right in the thick of it, could become casualties themselves once the enemy began to shell the positions and the approaches to where their medical facilities were. They weren't immune to death and wounds, despite the fact that they were part of what was a non-combatant unit treating the wounded. So the casualties amongst medical officers in the Great War, because of that, were often quite high, and indeed the medical personnel serving alongside them. But also here is a little plot of graves of some officers from the 13th Battalion Canadian Infantry, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel V.C. Buchanan, who were killed in a dugout at Courcelette on the 26th of September 1916. Now this dugout had a load of tins of fuel that the Germans had left behind in the back of it, and one day, with its door now facing towards the German front line, a shell came straight through the front of it, hit the tins of fuel, and there was a massive fireball, and everybody inside was killed, including Buchanan and several of these officers. They brought their remains back to Albert for burial, because even by that stage, only a week or so into the fighting at Courcelette, it was clear if you buried men on the battlefield there, this big open landscape where there was tremendous shell fire, then field graves could easily be destroyed, and they wanted to obviously mark the fact that their commanding officer had been killed and the officers with him, and they brought them back for burial. And when we look at quite a few of the officers' graves here at Albert that are Canadians, they are men killed at Courcelette rather than men brought back wounded who died of their wounds. The other thing that we see in this cemetery are the graves of tunnellers, men who worked beneath the Somme battlefields. The tunnellers had their headquarters in Albert on and off for quite a long period in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme, and the tunnelling companies that worked in places like La Boisselle at the Glory Hole, or in the area around what became known as Lochnagar, or in Mash Valley, were based in Albert, and when they suffered casualties in the tunnelling operations and the bodies could be recovered, they very often brought them back here for burial. You see some others in cemeteries like Becourt, close to Albert as well. So I suspect it's not a frequently visited cemetery, this one, but it's quite an important one in the story of the Battle of the Somme, because being a cemetery where predominantly the men are identified soldiers, so we know who they are, it gives us a good cross-section of the sort of units and the type of men that passed through this area of the Western Front in 1915 and 1916. So from that point of view, like all of these cemeteries made behind the front where men were brought in and could be identified rather than recovered from the terrible conditions on the ground, these sort of cemeteries do give us this insight, this important insight into units and men and the backgrounds of these men that fought in actions like this in the First World War. Leaving the cemetery, we'll come back onto the main road, which in this part of the D938 is the Rue 11th of November, quite aptly, and then we'll take the next turning on the left that will take us up past the Albert swimming pool on the left-hand side, and the Lycée Lamarck, which is named after Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who came from the village of Bazentin. He was the French scientist who, in the 18th and early 19th century, developed his own idea of the evolution of species alongside Darwin at that particular point. And in this area, this was all open fields at the time of the First World War. There was a position called Black Wood up here, and this was an approach area to the battlefields, and there were field gun positions here, firing up onto the German front line positions around La Boisselle and Fricourt and so on. And that'll take us through a number of little roads, and it doesn't matter which ones we take, onto the main road, the Albert Bapaume Road, where we'll go right and go in a sort of northeasterly direction out of the town, and then head over the roundabout up to right onto the outskirts of Albert, onto the approach to the rising ground of what was called Tara and Usna Hill, to a little cemetery on the right-hand side, and that'll be our next stop. Bapaume Post Military Cemetery sits just astride the old Albert Bapaume Road, and this was an approach route to the battlefields during the Great War. Before the Battle of the Somme, to come up over the top of the crest on which the cemetery sits on its reverse slope would have been suicidal, because as you come over the top of the two hills ahead of you, Tara and Usna Hill, you'd have been in perfect observation from the German positions in the villages of Overlers and La Boisselle and the valleys either side of that. Sausage Valley, one side, named after sausage-shaped observation balloons that popped up, and if you have a Sausage Valley, you've got to have a Mash Valley as well, and that's in the approaches to the village of Overlers. So around the area where the cemetery is now located, there were the communication trenches on this reverse slope, where men coming out of Albert would go into those trenches and begin their journey towards the front line. And those trenches were used throughout the rest of the Battle of the Somme as the fighting moved on to the next villages. Ahead of us in the distance is the Pozières Ridge, for example. So Australian troops came through here en route to the fighting there in July, August and early September of 1916. By about halfway through the battle, so by the time of the fighting around Courcelette and Martinpuy and High Wood, for example, it was safe to use this road, and there are images taken here of wagons and limbers passing the cemetery where you can see the crosses just on the side of the road as the men move up to the front. And by the end of the Somme in November of 1916, this was part of the main arterial route to the forward positions, now way ahead beyond the village of Les Sars at its furthest point, and then over to north of Courcelette towards Miramont. During that cold winter of the war of 1916-17, units marched past here on their way to those forward posts and then back past here into Albert to the rest camps beyond for a bit of respite out of the front line and out of that cold weather. So it meant that even then, even during the war, even during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, a place like this, just astride one of those main routes to and from the trenches, the collection of white crosses that would have marked this as a burial site was something that soldiers would see. And interviewing some of those veterans, as I did back in the 1980s and 90s, they would say that when you passed a place like this, you would tap the side of your helmet as you went past or give it a nod, because here were the graves of your comrades. They may not be men from your regiment, but these were men who'd fought in the line like you and had not come back. And I remember one of the veterans, Albert Banfield, mentioned that as he marched past a place like this, and it could well be close to here because his regiment, the 13th Royal Sussex, served not far from here in 1916. He couldn't actually remember which cemetery it was, but as he went past, it was a wet day, a typically wet day on the Western Front, and the rain was pinging on his helmet, and he looked up and he saw this field of crosses, amongst them the poppies growing in the rough undergrowth that surrounded these graves. And he said that forevermore on a drizzly day, walking the Sussex Downs above his home in Hove, he would think back to that moment, think back to those graves that he'd seen, and begin to remember the faces of the men who'd fought alongside him, including his own brother, who had died on the Western Front in 1918. So for the men, these became evocative places just as they are to us. No wooden crosses here now, but the splash of white stone in these gardens of remembrance that mark the cemeteries, the silent cities of the Western Front. Here at Bapaume Post there's 410 burials. It's not a particularly big cemetery. 181 of these are unidentified. The original plot is the plot right by the road. This is where the original burials were made during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and Bapaume Post was a position on this reverse slope that was constructed around the trench system that was here at that time, and was named after the Albert Bapaume road that the cemetery and indeed the post, the position, sat alongside. Amongst those burials there's 146 British soldiers, 64 Canadians, 18 Australians and 1 South African. And the cemetery covers the whole period of the Battle of the Somme from the very beginning of the 1st of July 1916 right through to the final attack on the 18th of November. On that first day of the Somme, the 2 Tyneside brigades of the 34th Division made their attack from near here. These were Kitchener's Army battalions, POWs battalions, raised in Newcastle in 1914, 4 battalions of Northumberland Fusiliers forming the Tyneside Scottish, and another 4 battalions of Northumberland Fusiliers forming the Tyneside Irish. And these men advanced up over the top of this ridge, over these 2 hills of the Tara-Usna line, down into the valley beyond to make their attack on the areas between Mash Valley and Sausage Valley, and suffered such terrible casualties in that advance. You'll find some of their burials here, including 2 battalion commanders who fell quite lightly at the head of their men. These were not officers that said, "OK, chaps, the Germans are that way, off you go." These were men who said, "Follow me." And there they were, lieutenant colonels leading their men into battle. And here we find the graves of Lieutenant Colonel Sillery and Lieutenant Colonel Lyle. They both commanded battalions of the Tyneside Scottish and died on that first day of the Battle of the Somme, that sunlit picture of hell as lines of men moved forward across this ridge to make their attack. Every soldier who died left behind some legacy beyond these battlefields, Colonel Lyle was one half of the Tate and Lyle sugar family, and there was once a memorial to him in their factory in London. When I lived in North London many years ago, I found a memorial to him on his wife's grave in Hampstead Cemetery. So it's funny how these names and these soldiers and their stories, you somehow trip over them, come across them, or perhaps they come across you, perhaps they seek you out. I guess it's all part of ensuring that they're never forgotten. But the grave that I would come to here most frequently in this cemetery is the grave of a Canadian officer. Again, it links to the village of Courcelette where I lived for many years. All of the Canadians that are buried in here are men that were either wounded at Courcelette and died en route back to the dressing station in Albert, or were killed up in the front line and brought back here for burial. And that grave that I always come to see when I visit this cemetery is that of Captain Henry Hutton Scott. He served with the 87th Battalion Canadian Infantry, the Grenadier Guards of Canada, and was killed in the attack on Regina Trench on the 21st of October 1916. His father was Canon Scott, an army chaplain in the 1st Canadian Division. He'd served with them from the very beginning during the Second Battle of Ypres, quiet times in Flanders, and then in the initial fighting for Courcelette village. His unit, he was attached to the 14th Battalion, the Royal Montreal Regiment. They'd pulled out of the line and gone north up towards Arras, and meanwhile his son's battalion had now taken part in the attack on Regina Trench, and news came to Canon Scott that his son had been killed, and that the body could not be found, could not be retrieved, although he'd been buried on the battlefield in the lip of a shell crater. Being a chaplain and having commission status as an officer, he was able to wangle his way back down to the Somme, and he met the remnants of his son's battalion in the brickfields north of Albert, a place where Canadian soldiers were billeted going to and from the front line at Courcelette. And here a group of men volunteered to go with him, to go back to Courcelette, to go and see if they could find his son's body and bring it back for a proper, decent, and in his mind, Christian burial. They took with them a limber used to carry the Lewis machine gun and marched up that long Roman road from Albert up towards the village of Courcelette, onto the shattered ground, and up onto that hellish wasteland where crater after crater marked the point where the fighting had been at its fiercest. They dug and found nothing, until by a miracle they found the remains of a grave on the lip of one of these craters, and Canon Scott recognised his son's body by the signet ring they'd given him for his 21st birthday. The remains of his son was placed in a ground sheet by that dedicated band of volunteers who had gone with Canon Scott, and they took him back to the Lewis gun cart and carried him from Courcelette back down the old Roman road to this point here at Bapaume Post, where he was buried amongst the fallen from earlier battles and alongside other Canadians who died at Courcelette. Canon Scott wrote about this in his memoirs, The Great War as I Saw It, and I'll put a link to that book on the podcast website. It's an incredible account, an honest account of the Great War, and it's clear that this incident completely broke him, the loss of his son, and with so much of the war still ahead. In fact, in 1918 he worries about the fate of his son's grave, because this ground is swept up in the German offensive of March 1918, and it's not seen by Allied troops until that summer. And there's a photograph of Canon Scott during that summer where he comes up here to the outskirts of Albert to see the fate of his son's grave, and it's still there, still marked by the same cross that he put up in 1916. The war tested the faith of so many men, even chaplains like Canon Scott. For some it broke their faith, for others, like Frederick Scott, it reinforced it. But you can't help but muse upon these things when you stand here and kneel down and touch Henry Scott's headstone and think of that moment when, beyond hope, somehow they found his body up there on the moonscape beyond Courcelette. In that respect, perhaps you could say that Captain Scott was lucky. He has a known grave. He's one of more than 8,500 Canadians who fell at Courcelette in 1916. Of them, over 6,000 have no known grave, and their names are listed on the Vimy Memorial near Arras. Thousands of men who disappeared into that Courcelette moonscape, ground which continues to give up its secrets of the dead. Even in my lifetime, several Canadian soldiers have been recovered from the fields about Courcelette. The story of the Great War, once more, never stops. That last page never turns. And as we bid farewell to the lads buried here in Bapaume Post, and walk up the road a little way to the crest of the ridge, with the Tara and Usna hills to our left and right, We look across the rolling downlands of the Somme, and the villages and the fields, and the sites of so many battles astride that old Roman road. These are places to visit another day, another journey, along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.